They swore an oath to defend the United States, but instead, they became its greatest threat. These are the soldiers whose crimes were so brutal, so unthinkable, that even the military, the very institution that trained them, turned against them. Since 1916, over 130 executions have been carried out by the armed forces. But for the past 50 years, that silence has raised questions. Why hasn't the military executed anyone since? And what crimes were so egregious that death was the only sentence? This is not just about murder. It's about betrayal from within. These men were trained to protect, but ended up killing their own. Do you believe the military should carry out these death sentences? Or have they waited too long? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into criminal history. Let's find out. Case 1. DNA Never Lies. The Haunting of Timothy B. Hennis, May 1985, Fayetteville, North Carolina. Just days before Mother's Day, a horrific crime shattered the quiet military community surrounding Fort Bragg. Captain Gary Eastburn of the U.S. Air Force was away in Alabama for training. His wife, Catherine, remained at home with their 3 daughters, 5-year-old Kara, 3-year-old Erin, and 22-month-old Jana, as they prepared for an overseas move to England. To lighten their load, the Eastburns placed an ad offering their English setter, Dixie, to a good home. It was answered by 27-year-old Army Sergeant Timothy Hennis. He was polite, clean-cut, and seemingly kind. Catherine gave him the dog on May 7th. 4 days later, silence fell on the Eastburn home. Captain Eastburn's daily calls went unanswered. Newspapers piled up. A baby's cry was heard through closed windows. On May 12th, police entered and discovered a nightmare. Catherine had been raped and stabbed. Kara and Erin were found dead in their bedrooms. Only baby Jana, dehydrated but alive, was spared. The brutality of the murders shook investigators, but the trail led quickly to Hennis. Neighbors had seen a man in a members-only jacket leaving the house. The adoption of the dog provided a direct link. Hennis matched the description and was arrested. In 1986, he was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But in 1989, that conviction was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct. At a retrial, the jury acquitted him, citing lack of direct evidence. Hennis walked free, re-enlisted, rose to the rank of staff sergeant, and retired in 2004. But the story didn't end there. In 2006, DNA testing on preserved evidence from Catherine's body matched Hennis. Civilian courts couldn't retry him due to double jeopardy. But under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the Army recalled Hennis to active duty in 2010 for a court-martial. The jury of military peers found him guilty. Once again, he was sentenced to death. Timothy Hennis now sits on death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His fate undecided, decades after his alleged crime. Justice found Hennis not once, but twice. But the next case wasn't about evidence resurfacing. It was about a calculated betrayal that erupted without warning. Case 2. Enemy Within the Ranks, Hassan Karim Akbar. March 23, 2003. Camp, Pennsylvania, Kuwait. On the eve of the Iraq invasion, soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division were on high alert, prepping for war. But nothing could prepare them for what came next. At 1 a.m., the camp's generator suddenly went dark. Soldiers, sleeping in their tents, were plunged into blackness. Then came the explosions. Hand grenades tore through the fabric of the tents, followed by gunfire. Screams pierced the night. Chaos erupted as soldiers scrambled for their lives, many still in their bunks. The attacker was one of their own. Sergeant Hassan Karim Akbar. Armed with an M4 rifle, Akbar fired on those he called brothers. Army Captain Christopher Seifert and Air Force Major Gregory Stone were killed. 14 others were wounded. The rampage was swift, brutal, and deliberate. Akbar was tackled and arrested by fellow soldiers. When authorities searched his belongings, they found a journal. One entry, dated February 4, 2003, read, "I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible." At trial, prosecutors presented this diary as proof of premeditation. They argued that Akbar, plagued by paranoia and resentment, had planned the attack for weeks. The defense claimed mental illness, but the jury saw cold-blooded murder. On April 21, 2005, Akbar was convicted of 2 counts of premeditated murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. All appeals have failed. Today, he sits on military death row at Fort Leavenworth. His execution awaits only a presidential signature, the final word in a betrayal that redefined the term friendly fire. Akbar's assault came from paranoia and rage. But the next case stems from something darker, a pattern of predatory violence committed under the Army's own banner. Case 3. The Predator of Fort Bragg, Ronald Adrian Gray. Between April 1986 and January 1987, terror gripped Fort Bragg. Women, both civilian and military, were disappearing. Their bodies surfaced later, brutalized, violated, murdered. The man responsible? Army Specialist Ronald Adrian Gray. Gray served with the 82nd Airborne Division. On duty, he cooked meals. Off duty, he hunted. His first known victim, 23-year-old student Linda Jean Coates, was found murdered on April 27, 1986. Then came 18-year-old Tammy Kofer Wilson. Then, Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay. Raped, shot, and dumped in the woods. Gray left a trail of evidence: a stolen .22 pistol, DNA, witnesses. One survivor, Private Mary Ann Lang Namath, identified him after he broke into her barracks, raped, and nearly killed her. Her testimony was pivotal. Before police could act, Gray killed again. On January 6, 1987, cab driver Kimberly Ruggles was found stabbed to death. Her blood was in Gray's home. His fingerprints were in her taxi. Gray confessed. In civilian court, he received 8 life sentences. But under military law, that wasn't enough. In April 1988, a military tribunal convicted him of 2 premeditated murders, 1 attempted murder, and multiple rapes. He was sentenced to death. In 2008, President George W. Bush approved the execution, marking the first presidential approval of a military death sentence since 1957. Yet decades later, Ronald Gray remains on death row. His appeals continue. Gray's case stands as a brutal reminder that the enemy can lurk within, not in ideology, not in error, but in monstrous intent masked by a uniform. If Gray embodied pure evil, the next man represented something far more insidious, a healer who became the executioner. Case 4. The Psychiatrist Who Snapped, Nidal Malik Hassan. It was a Thursday afternoon at Fort Hood, Texas, November 5, 2009. Soldiers and civilians bustled through the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, preparing for deployment. The atmosphere was tense but routine, until a man who had once taken an oath to heal turned his weapons on his own. Major Nidal Malik Hassan, an Army psychiatrist, entered the building carrying 2 handguns, a FN-57 semi-automatic and a .357 Magnum revolver. Witnesses heard him shout, "Allahu Akbar," before he opened fire. Within moments, bodies fell. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled under tables. Some crashed through windows. Screams echoed as Hassan moved methodically, targeting anyone who moved. By the time the bullets stopped, 13 people were dead. Over 30 more were wounded. It was the deadliest mass shooting on a U.S. military base in American history. And the shooter wasn't an enemy insurgent. He was one of their own. Hassan's background was, at first glance, admirable. A graduate of Virginia Tech and the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, he had treated numerous soldiers battling PTSD. But beneath the surface, a storm had been brewing. Hassan had grown increasingly vocal in his opposition to U.S. military operations in the Middle East. Intelligence agencies later uncovered emails between him and radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, communications that suggested deepening ideological ties to jihadist extremism. After being shot multiple times by responding officers, Hassan was left paralyzed from the waist down. He survived and was charged with 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. His trial began in August 2013. Hassan, unrepentant, represented himself. He offered no defense, no remorse. He openly declared his allegiance to Islamist ideology, calling himself a soldier who had switched sides. The military jury deliberated briefly. On August 28, 2013, they sentenced him to death. Today, Major Hassan sits in a specialized wing of the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He's the first American-born terrorist to receive the military's death penalty in decades. But his execution, like those before him, remains stalled. If Hassan's story showed how ideology can warp duty, the next tale is even more haunting. A soldier who deserted not for ideology, but out of fear. His punishment? A bullet from his own countrymen. Case 5. The Army's Scapegoat, Eddie Slovic. World War II forged heroes, but it also demanded sacrifices. In the brutal winter of 1945, one man became the face of military punishment. His name was Eddie Slovic. His crime? Desertion. His fate? Death by firing squad. Edward Donald Slovic was a 24-year-old infantryman from Detroit, drafted in 1944. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't a war hawk. He was a man terrified of combat. When he landed in France with the 28th Infantry Division, it took just one chaotic artillery barrage for him to walk away from the front lines. But unlike other deserters, Slovic didn't run. He confessed. He handed his commanding officer a written statement explaining he would not fight. He thought honesty would earn him a jail sentence. He was wrong. Military commanders were furious. With discipline cracking under relentless warfare, they saw Slovic's defiance as contagious. Court-martialed in a swift trial, he had no legal defense, no character witnesses, no leniency. He was sentenced to death, the only U.S. soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. On January 31, 1945, near Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, France, Slovic was tied to a post and shot by a firing squad. The bullet holes in his body weren't just punishment. They were a message to every soldier wavering at the front: stand your ground or face the same fate. Case 6. The Nazi spy from Connecticut, William Colpaw. Case 6. In the midst of World War II, the U.S. Navy trained him. The Nazis recruited him, and espionage nearly made him one of America's most notorious traitors. William Colpaw was born in Connecticut, but grew up idolizing Germany. By 1943, he was serving in the U.S. Navy. But something festered beneath his uniform, a loyalty not to the stars and stripes, but to the swastika. In late 1944, Colpaw jumped ship in South America and made his way to Germany. There, he offered himself to Nazi intelligence. The Germans saw opportunity. and trained him in sabotage and surveillance. They paired him with seasoned spy Eric Gimple. Their mission: infiltrate the U.S., gather intelligence on nuclear weapons development, and sow chaos. Delivered to Maine via U-boat in November 1944, the pair carried cash, radio parts, and a deadly plan. But Colepaugh didn't last. He squandered much of their funds on women and alcohol. Guilt, or perhaps fear, set in. Within weeks, Colepaugh surrendered to the FBI and exposed the entire mission. From Fort Bragg to Fort Hood, from World War II battlefields to covert Nazi plots, these cases reveal a harrowing truth. Not all threats to America wear enemy uniforms. Some come from within, from those trained, armed, and trusted to protect. The military death penalty stands as the harshest sentence for the gravest betrayals. Yet even decades later, executions remain stalled, tangled in legal and political limbo. These men wait in silence at Fort Leavenworth, their crimes etched into the darkest pages of military history. But the final verdict, life or death, still hangs in the balance. What do you think? Should these executions finally be carried out? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unflinching looks into the most disturbing corners of the justice system.